Sighs. You need to drink, my lady. Stay with me. And GT, it's too late. I'm so tired. And GT. She was exiled because she refused to kneel, and the last thing her father's court expected was for a human freighter pilot to find her dying in the snow and decide the entire empire could go to hell. 3 things are going to happen in the next 20 minutes. You're going to watch a princess get thrown off her own home world for telling the truth. You're going to watch a human do something no alien empire has ever planned for, which is simply refuse to leave. And you're going to find out exactly why. Every species in this galaxy has a saying now. Never corner a human because they don't know they're supposed to be afraid of you. Let's start where it started going wrong. For everyone who thought this would be easy. Her name was Sever Kalos III, daughter of the Das royal line, and she was never supposed to inherit anything. The Das court ran on a rule older than the stars they'd colonized. Silence is loyalty, and loyalty is survival. You didn't question the High Regent. You didn't question the trade deals that bled the outer provinces dry to fatten the capital. You definitely didn't stand up in a chamber of 300 nobles and call your own father a coward in front of the Velcaric trade delegation. Severed it all 3 in about 90 seconds, and the silence after she sat back down was the loudest thing the chamber had heard in a decade. What set her off wasn't some grand ideological awakening. It was a manifest. She'd been quietly auditing provincial shipments for 2 years as part of a ceremonial council seat nobody expected her to take seriously. And the numbers from the outer mining colonies kept coming back wrong in a way. That wasn't a clerical error, it was a pattern. Grain quotas inflated on paper while actual deliveries shrank. Medical shipments rerouted through 3 shell brokers before reaching colonies that were on the books fully supplied, and in reality burying children from preventable fevers. She brought it to her father privately first, the way she'd been raised to in his private study with the star charts on the wall and the good light from the eastern window. He told her the numbers were a diplomatic necessity, that the Velcaric trade terms required certain accommodations, and that a daughter who wanted to matter someday would learn not to ask questions that made the wrong people uncomfortable. She asked him one more question after that. Comfortable for who? He didn't answer her, and she never forgot that he didn't. So when the Velcaric delegation sat in that chamber 3 weeks later, robes pressed, translators humming, ready to sign the next decade of the same arrangement, Sever stood up during the ceremonial address and read the real numbers into the record out loud in front of every noble house and every foreign dignitary who mattered. She named the shell brokers, she named the colonies. She looked directly at her father while she did it and called the arrangement what it actually was, which was children dying so a court could keep importing luxury textiles, and she called him a coward for signing off on it twice. Chamber didn't gasp, it went silent the way a room goes silent right before something breaks, and everyone there understood instantly that there was no version of court life where this got forgiven. Here's the part nobody tells you about royal courts. They're not run by fear of armies, they're run by fear of irrelevance. The High Regent couldn't execute his own daughter, not with a Velcaric delegation watching not with half the outer provinces already murmuring her name, like a password. So he did something quieter and crueler. He stripped her title, sealed her accounts, and had her shuttle malfunction on a transfer route that just happened to pass within range of Karin's drift, a frozen rock with a thin atmosphere, no settlements, and a surface temperature that drops 60 degrees the moment the system's dim sun sets. No assassination, no trial, just an empty manifest and a girl in an emergency suit with maybe 18 hours of heat charge watching her father's flagship burn away into the dark without firing a single shot to mark the moment. That's how you erase someone in a court. Like that, you don't kill them, you let the universe do it, and you keep your hands clean enough to still be invited to dinner. She got 11 of those 18 hours into a cave system before her suit started throwing warnings. She didn't have the parts to fix. The cave wasn't shelter so much as a slightly slower way to die, a crack in basalt rock barely wide enough to crawl into, windless but not warm, and she spent most of those hours doing the math herself, recalculating her remaining charge every time the suit's display flickered, the way you do when you've spent your whole life being trained to find an angle and refuse to believe there isn't one. There wasn't one. She knew that by hour 9. She kept recalculating anyway because the alternative was sitting still with that knowledge, and even exiled and freezing, she wasn't built for sitting still with anything. This is exactly the moment the story was supposed to end. A failed princess, a forgotten rock, a slow, cold quiet. That's how it goes in every system that's ever turned its back on someone. Inconvenient. Except Karin's drift had one thing. Nobody in the DOS court bothered to check. It sat directly on a half-charted supply corridor that an independent human hauler named Murado used because it shaved 4 days off her fuel costs, and nobody official ever flew it. Mara wasn't a soldier, wasn't a diplomat, wasn't anyone's hero. She hauled industrial coolant and spare parts between 3 systems for a living, and she only sat down on that frozen rock because her ship's sensor array picked up an anomaly that turned out to be a heat signature where there shouldn't be one. She found Severine face down in the snow, 11 minutes from the edge of her suit's heat reserve, alive only because human-grade tech runs warmer margins than half the galaxy assumes, and even Mara would tell you later that the math should not have worked out that way. It worked out anyway. Mara didn't hesitate at the cave mouth, weighing risk against reward in the way a more cautious captain might have. She dropped the boarding ramp, hauled the suit's dead weight across 40 m of ice on a cargo sled meant for crates of coolant lines, and didn't stop running diagnostics until the medbay confirmed a pulse. She'd later say the whole thing took less thinking than deciding what to eat for dinner, and she meant it as a simple statement of fact, not modesty. Stick with me, because the next part is where this stops being a rescue story and starts being a problem for an entire empire. And that problem has a name, and the name is what humans do after they decide they're keeping you. Mara didn't know who Sever was, didn't have a translator fluent enough to catch the royal dialect, didn't recognize the dude's sigil half melted into the suit's shoulder plate. All she knew was that there was a person freezing to death on a rock with no business having a person on it, and the math on that was simple in a way it apparently isn't for everyone else in This galaxy, you don't leave people to die when you have room on your ship and a working med bay. She hauled Sever aboard, ran the suit's emergency thermal cycle in reverse, and spent the next 6 hours doing something that should have been routine and somehow became the single most consequential medical intervention in 3 sectors. Because here's what nobody on that flagship accounted for. The malfunction that stranded Severin had a flight log. Flight logs get backed up to corridor relay stations whether or not anyone wants them to. And once Severin was conscious, fed, and warm enough to think straight, the first thing she did wasn't thank Mara, wasn't cry, wasn't fall into the kind of grateful collapse a court physician would have expected from a noble who just survived an assassination. Dressed up as an accident, she asked for a terminal, pulled the relay logs herself, and started building a case. That's the moment the High Region's plan stopped being a quiet eraser and started being evidence. She worked for 6 straight hours wrapped in a thermal blanket that smelled like engine coolant, referencing the shuttle's actual flight path against the filed flight plan, pulling timestamp discrepancies that no honest malfunction could explain, and building a timeline so clean that Myra, watching over her shoulder with 0 legal training, said it looked less like a survivor processing trauma and more like someone assembling a court case before breakfast. Sever's answer was simple. She said the only way to survive a court that erases people quietly is to make sure you're too loud to erase second time. And then she kept working, because the version of grief where you fall apart first and fight back later was a luxury. She decided somewhere in that cave she wasn't going to allow herself. Now here's where most species would have backed off, most independent haulers, once they realize they've just rescued royalty from a politically engineered accident, do the smart thing. Drop the passenger at the nearest neutral station, collect a finder fee if there is one, and get gone before any Empire's enforcement arm starts asking why your ship's transponder was in restricted airspace. That's not cowardice, that's just math. Everyone else in this galaxy has learned to respect, because empires don't forgive freighter pilots who embarrass them, and a single ship has no leverage against a fleet. Mara looked at that math and apparently decided it was somebody else's math. When the Doss's court realized Severin hadn't died on schedule, they didn't panic, not yet. They sent what's called a quiet retrieval team, 3 operatives with falsified trade credentials whose actual job was to board Mara's ship under the pretense of a cargo inspection and simply not have Severin be aboard anymore when they left. This is standard procedure. It works on almost everyone, because almost everyone understands the unspoken rule. When an empire sends people to make a problem disappear, you let the problem disappear, because the alternative is you disappear too. Myra denied them boarding, not negotiated, not delayed, denied. Stood in her own cargo bay doorway and told 3 armed operatives from an empire with more warships than her home system has ever built that they weren't getting on her ship without a warrant from a body that didn't exist yet, because human flagged independent vessels in unclaimed corridors operate under a jurisdiction loophole so obscure that the operatives had to actually radio back to confirm it was real. It was real. It had just never mattered before, because nobody had ever been stubborn enough to invoke it against an empire's own retrieval team. The lead operative, a DOS enforcement officer named Calvin Brask, who'd handled exactly this kind of quiet errand 11 times before without complications, later told a sector inquiry that the strangest part wasn't the legal argument, it was Mara's tone while she made it. No fear in her voice, no posturing, nothing that read as bravado, just the flat, mildly inconvenienced cadence of someone reciting a policy she expected him to already know, the same tone you'd use telling a delivery driver they've got the wrong address. He said it through his entire read on the situation, because every species he'd ever run this maneuver on understood on some instinctive level that you don't stand your ground against an empire's enforcement arm. Mara apparently never got that memo or got it, and decided it didn't apply to her cargo bay. That's the part that should have set off alarms across half the sector, and somehow didn't because nobody had built a category yet for human who simply will not move. The DOS court escalated the way courts always escalate, not with violence first but with money, because money is quieter and usually works. They offered Mara a settlement that would have let her retire 3 systems over in genuine comfort, no questions, no records, just a clean transfer, and a girl who'd never existed handed back to people who'd arranged her death once already. It was, by every metric Mara's own species uses for sound decisionum, an insanely good offer. She turned it down in under 4 seconds, and the way she phrased it became almost word for word the line that ended up on protest banners across the outer provinces 6 months later. She's not cargo, and I don't sell people back to the guy who tried to kill them. What the DOS court didn't understand, and what almost nothing in this galaxy understands about humans until it's far too late, is that humans don't calculate risk the way empires expect. An empire calculates threat by mass. How many ships, how much firepower, how many systems can be brought to bear. Humans, especially the ones who have spent their lives on the unglamorous edges of explored space, hauling coolant and scrap and machine parts nobody else wants to move, calculate threat by precedent. And the precedent Mara was refusing to set wasn't that she would fight an empire and win. It was that if she handed Severin back, she would spend the rest of her life knowing exactly what kind of person she decided to be, and that was a worse outcome than dying. Empires have never quite figured out what to do with a species that treats its own self-respect as a harder currency than survival, because every other species they've conquered eventually runs the numbers and folds. Humans run the same numbers and sometimes just don't. This is where the story stops being about one girl and one pilot and starts being about why every major power in this part of the galaxy is now quietly rewriting its threat assessments. The DOS court made one final mistake, and it's the mistake every empire in this story eventually makes. They assumed Mara was alone. She wasn't. Not really. Human commercial shipping lanes run on something most empires never bothered to map, which is reputation networks built entirely out of word of mouth, relay chatter, and the kind of mutual aid that doesn't show up on any official registry because nobody filed paperwork for it. When the retrieval team's ship got logged loitering near a human-flagged vessel under suspicious pretenses, that information didn't stay quiet. It moved through 3 relay stations and, under a day, the way gossip moves, through a small town. Except the small town was 40,000. Independent haulers spread across 6 systems who all shared exactly one cultural reflex. Nobody touches one of ours while we're watching. Within 72 hours, Mara's ship had unofficial escort, not military, not even armed. Mostly just 11 other independent human vessels who rerouted their own cargo runs to fly loose formation near her ship through the corridor, broadcasting nothing but their presence because the message didn't need words. One of those captains, an older man named Desmond Ichbe, who'd flown the same route for 19 years, put it to a local reporter afterward in a way that ended up quoted more than anything Sean or Mara ever said publicly. He said, "Humans don't have an empire. Out here they don't have a fleet. They don't have a flag that means anything to the powers that actually run this part of the galaxy. But they have each other's word. And that word has never once been worth less than a warship, because a warship can be outmaneuvered and a kept word generally can't." The DOS retrieval team radioed home for new orders and got radio silence for 6 hours, which in court politics is its own kind of answer. And here's the part that actually broke the High Regent's plan beyond repair. Sever's case, the one she'd built from relay logs in the first 6 hours after waking up in a stranger's medbay, reached the Valkyric trade delegation before the DOS court could spin a counter-narrative. The Valkyric weren't moved by sympathy. They were moved by liability, because a High Regent willing to fake an accident to erase his own daughter was a High Regent willing to fake anything. And that made every trade agreement his signature was on suddenly look a lot less stable. Within a month, the outer provinces that had been murmuring Severin's name like a password started saying it out loud in council chambers with documentation. The High Regent didn't fall in some dramatic uprising. He fell the way most quiet tyrants actually fall, which is boring and bureaucratic. Trade partners pulled out. Internal factions smelled blood, and a no confidence vote he'd never thought possible 6 months earlier passed by a margin nobody bothered to dispute. He spent his final address to the chamber, not apologizing, not even really defending himself, but complaining that the rules had changed too fast for anyone to keep up with, which several council members later noted was the closest thing to an admission of guilt the man ever managed to produce. He was quietly relocated to a minor coastal estate with a pension and no further say in provincial governance, which for a man who'd once controlled the fates of 6 systems with a signature was its own kind of poetic ending. Sever didn't reclaim a throne, because by then she didn't want one. She took a seat on the reformed provincial council instead, the one that actually answered to the people getting bled dry by trade deals. And the first policy she pushed through was full legal protection for independent shipping crews operating in DOS territory, specifically naming the jurisdiction loophole Mara had used, so no retrieve team could ever again pretend it didn't exist. The second policy she pushed through, less publicized but arguably more important, was a standing audit office with actual enforcement teeth, staffed by people who couldn't be quietly transferred or memoed into silence the way she once nearly was, because she'd learned in the most personal way possible exactly how a system protects itself when the only Thing standing between it and accountability is one person's willingness to ask an uncomfortable question. Myra, for her part, never wanted any of the credit. She still hauls coolant and spare parts. She just does it now with a standing reputation that follows her into every port she touches. The pilot who told an empire no and made it stick, and a quote stitched somewhere into the unofficial folklore of human shipping lanes that other species have started repeating like a warning label. She's not cargo. If you want the short version of why this story keeps getting told across a dozen systems, it's this. Empires plan for armies, they plan for rival fleets, for trade wars, for rebellions with manifestos and leadership structures they can negotiate with or crush. Nobody plans for one tired freighter pilot deciding in the snort space of about 4 seconds that her own sense of decency is worth more than every ship the other side could ever threaten her with. That's the thing about humans nobody in this galaxy saw coming until it was sitting in their cargo bay, refusing to move. You can outgun them, you can outnumber them, you apparently cannot oust them. And an entire royal court found that out from a single woman standing in a doorway. If this story hit the way it's supposed to, there's a whole shelf of these humans refusing to be reasonable about exactly the wrong things at exactly the right time, and the next one might be even harder to believe than this one. Go check the channel, find the next story in the list, and subscribe if you want the next one waiting for you the moment it drops, because this galaxy is not running out of empires who underestimate us.